travesty, the Holocaust, the memories, we must never forget. We must always remember and always tell the story and always strive to be better. And that's why we're here, and that's why hopefully you're here too. So we're grateful to everyone being here and listening. I'm just going to offer a quick word of prayer and then turn it over to the other speakers here at the monument. As we gather here tonight, Lord, we just ask your presence. We ask your blessing upon these proceedings. And God, we know that so many who have lost their lives, taken, so many that could have been a blessing to this earth. Lord, we couldn't do anything back then except what was done, a world war. But we can do something now by speaking up when we see something going wrong. We can speak to our leaders. We can speak to one another, and we can try a different way, a way that you have set before us, a way of service, a way of love, a way of caring for others, even more than we care for ourselves. That is our prayer. That is our hope. And let that be our pledge. In God's name, I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Well, for everyone watching out there, I'm John Mitchell. I'm the mayor of New Bedford, proudly standing before the Holocaust Memorial that was erected in the 1980s for the great work of so many folks in our city, headed up by the Federation of Greater New Bedford. And I will reiterate for the viewing audience what I just said to Cindy and to Reverend Lima just a moment ago, and that's this. I'm just so pleased that we could come together this year, that it was just safe enough for us to be at this site, because what's so important about our celebrating or paying tribute today on Yom HaShoah is the act, emphasis on the act of remembrance. Showing up counts. I always come to this event, I have to confess, well, let me just say a couple things. I come to this event every year grateful for Cindy Yokin and Mel Yokin and Rabbi Cantor and Cantor Schubrick, and of course Dave Levy's been here with us so many years, and all of you are uncompromising in making this happen. And to my mind, I will, in addition to being appreciative, I have to say I struggle every year to say something that's meaningful and different, because the Holocaust is an event that words can't capture, at least the words that I have the power of using cannot capture adequately. And so there are others here who through their stories could capture far more than ever I could. One of the things that animates me always, and this is the story I have, is just, we talked about my grandfather before and at these events. And he was, a kid who grew up in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood of this city, and who, as a young soldier, was with an artillery battalion. It was a young officer in an artillery battalion that was one of the units credited with the liberation of Dachau. And he only told me about that event once. I think it was at a weak moment. It was at my great grandmother's funeral, actually. And that moment never left me. Never could dare to bring it up again with me. But I think about what he described, what he saw, the seared impression that he had at that moment, and to my mind, I think that I have to, as mayor, ensure that in some small way that memory must endure. And that's only describing what one witness saw, not somebody who actually experienced the camps as a detainee. but that's the story that lingers with me most. So, I tend to be somebody, maybe as an attorney, maybe just by disposition, somebody who tries to think logically through these issues and try to describe and frame things in logical terms. But the Holocaust provides logic. It's really coming together every year and telling the stories, and the stories stick with you. Stories allow for memory. They allow for the passing on of something that can't readily be described. And so I just want to thank all of you for permitting us to tell stories so that we can remember, so that we can understand better and act in our own ways, not to allow others to be diminished on bases that have nothing to do with the content of their character. Martin Luther King observed, genocide is the logical extension of racism. I'm paraphrasing now, but you get the point that it's when we diminish people, there's no the ultimate logical progression of that is what happened in the Holocaust, what's happened at other points in human history. And it's left up to us as parents, as community leaders, not to let that happen, to keep that, to have the perspective necessary to act when action is required. So again, I just want to thank all of you, especially Cindy, Mel, and everybody, Rafi, Nate, everybody for organizing this year. Because it's so important to everybody in our city, and far beyond humanity in general, particularly this year. Thanks.
Thank you, Mayor.
Ma'alot Kedoshim U'Tahorim Kezohar Harati Amazirim Kol HaNeshamot Shoshet Milyonei HaYehudim Anashim Nashim V'Tam Shenehagu V'Shenishpatu V'Shenishrefu V'Shenishberu Chayim Al Kiddush Hashem Idei Hamiratzim HaGermanim V'Yosreihem Yishar HaAmim Ba'al HaRachamim Yashirein V'Sete Knafach Al Yolamim Yisrael B'Tzor HaChayim Et Mishlotehem V'Ganei Den Tehei Menuchatam V'yakumu leketzi yamin lechayotam v'nomar Amen.
Holocaust in memory of the 6 million Jews and millions of other victims slaughtered by the Nazis during the Holocaust of 1939 through 1945. The young, the promising, the aged, our scholars, rabbis, leaders, mothers, fathers, brothers and sisters, entire families, an entire generation murdered, but never forgotten. Adam Fisher wrote, "In the anguish of the Shoah, the Holocaust, and in the deliverance of a remnant, we seek you, O God. In light and in darkness, we affirm that you are our creator, one who walked with our people through history, the one with whom we walk through our own lives. You are the one in whom we place our trust, that you will remember the hopes of the slain by redeeming your shattered world. You are the one in whom we place our trust, that in spite of everything which strangles hope, you will help us continue the sustaining song of their lives. You are the one
who strengthens our resolve to keep our people alive. You are the one who keeps alive our dream that this might yet be a better world. So it is incumbent upon us not just mourn, not just remember. Let it be our purpose that we will make this world a better place, a place where we discriminate against no one, and we include everyone. Let that be our goal and our purpose, and let us say, Amen.
Amen. I want to thank everybody who participated today. Rabbi, Mayor Mitchell, Reverend Lima, Cantor Shudrick, Cindy, and Ilana, and also to those who document. By standing behind the camera, you are transmitting this and making it available for more people, which is equally important. I'm going to pass over this emceeing part to Manya, who is sitting at home and will continue the rest of the program on Zoom. For those of you who have not yet logged in, the information is available in the various communications we have sent you over the past few days. And there is an interesting discussion to follow. So while I make my way to my office, not too far from here, to continue and participate from there, Manya, please take it away and continue the evening. And thank you so much for everyone here.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We have an interesting program to follow. We have Rachel Karate. She has, she's an award-winning photographer. She's a writer, educator, audio producer, and her narrative, the podcast, We Share the Same Sky, recalls the story of her grandmother, which is interwoven with her own quest to retrace her grandmother's footsteps. And it received rave reviews across different podcast platforms. She has a new platform coming out called The Memory Generation, which is with the Shoah Foundation and Stephen D. Smith. And it will be available in the next 2 to 3 weeks. She also has a forthcoming book called We Share the Same Sky, and that will be available sometime in August. For more information, you can visit her website, We Share the Same Sky. To follow, we're going to have a 3-person panel, starting off with Ms. Renee Ledbetter, who works with the Shannon program in New Bedford, which is managed by the United Way of Greater New Bedford. She will be discussing the state of racial injustice and how the rise of hate and how that affects our own community here in New Bedford. Will be followed by Mr. David A. Gomes from the University of Dartmouth, who's the diversity office. And he will also be discussing similar issues. And then finally, we'll talk with Mr. Rob DeLayle from BCC Community College. And then at the end of the program, we will have it open for some comments and discussions and see, as the rabbi said, how we can make this community a place which is a better world in our own community, and branch out to make this world a better place where hate and injustice is eliminated. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm trying to see if I can switch Amir off here. One moment, move spotlight. Okay.
Hi everyone, thank you for having me on this commemorative day. My name is Rachel Sarati and I am a photographer, a writer, an educator, and an audio producer. But more importantly than any of those things, I am the granddaughter of a fierce woman named Hannah Dubova, who was a Holocaust survivor. Growing up, I knew that my grandmother was a survivor, and I knew that she was the only one in her family who was alive at the end of the war. It wasn't a secret, it was just part of who we were. The Holocaust was the reason my mother had no grandparents, and survival was the reason that I had mine. Knowing it was not a burden, At least I don't remember it being. It just was. And I think in some ways that's the role of the grandchild. We accept what comes before as normal. I knew that my grandmother only survived because of the kindness of strangers. As a child, I remember her telling her epic story of escape. She fled Czechoslovakia for Denmark when she was 14, and then she fled Denmark for Sweden when she was 18. I recounted to friends like it was a badge of honor that my grandmother escaped the Nazis, being hidden beneath herring on an overcrowded and illegal fishing boat. It wasn't until I was in college that I began to take a deeper interest in my grandmother's history and began to process the gravity of the Holocaust and what it means to inherit this history. In the summer of 2009, I was 20 years old and asked my grandmother to tell me her story. We were sitting by her apartment complex's pool just outside of Philadelphia, and it's one of those memories that feels as much like it was yesterday, as much as it feels like fiction. "You've heard it before," is what she said to me with a very playful tone after I asked for her to retell it. And while I told her that yes, that was true, I had heard her story before, I wanted to hear it again, and this time with it being just the two of us. I wanted to hear how she would tell it to her granddaughter. And that began our storytelling sessions, and those continued for a little bit more than a year, up until a few weeks before she passed away. I didn't have plans for what to do with her testimony at the time. I couldn't have predicted that her story would become the backbone of my professional life and the narrator of my personal life. Today, I'm going to share with you a couple readings from my forthcoming memoir, We Share the Same Sky, which tells the story of my decade-long journey to retrace my grandmother's war story. The book will be published this August and is coming off the heels of my podcast, which is also titled We Share the Same Sky. So the first passage that I'd like to read to you is how I started falling into the details and the depths of my grandmother's story. On October 8th, 2010, Mutti passed away. We all called my grandmother Mutti. It means mother in German. There were no tubes or sterile walls. There were no doctors dictating visiting hours or nurses checking her vitals. Hannah died at home, a place that she had fought so many times over to create for herself. Her body lay peacefully. It was the first time I touched a dead body, but I didn't cry. My memory is in black and white. I remember her skin being cold and soft. I took her hand and kissed it. Surrounding her were her pictures, her writings, and the delicate pages that proved her past. It was everything that I, unknowingly at that time, would come to wrap my world around. In the years after her death, I uncovered the most beautiful archive of her life. It wasn't a hidden archive or a secret one. It was just what she had left behind. It was everything that she had told me, curated and edited. There were preserved albums and hundreds of photographs dating back to the 1920s. There were letters waiting to be translated, journals, diaries, deportation, and immigration papers. There were pieces of creative writing from various stages of her life, some marked up with line edits. The archive was seemingly endless. Every time I thought I had found the last box, I discovered another. There were repeated stories, some written at age 14 and others at age 80. There were anecdotes and memories that contradicted each other, bringing the question of memory into all of her stories. There were childhood report cards and souvenirs from her cross-country travels. There were confessions of love, secrets intended to stay private, and flashbacks never intended to be understood. She had written about being a daughter, a sister, a granddaughter, and a cousin, a friend, a student, and a dedicated member of her youth group. She was a strong-willed teen, a refugee, and an orphan. She was a survivor and a victim, a wanderer, and someone who dreamed of home. She was a hopeful immigrant and a forced emigrant. She was an urban dweller and a farmer. She was a pioneer and a storyteller. She was a Czech child, a stateless teen, and an American wife. She was a traveler, an explorer, a teacher, and a student. She spoke 6 languages. She was a divorcee to one and a reignited flame to another. And for other men, she was the one who got away. She was a bride, a mother, and a grandmother, a young person searching for her future, and an elderly person watching her grandchildren search for theirs. I became obsessed with this material, adopting it as my own and taking it with me when I moved back to Boston after graduating from college. My methods of preserving my grandmother's story would have appalled any professional archivist. These were documents and photographs that should have been handled in a clean environment and stored in boxes that were waterproof and fire resistant and let in no light. These were delicate, worn pieces of paper, and yet here I was, sitting on my bedroom floor, moving them from one pile to another and storing them in manila folders with little to no protection. I digitized and organized it all, plucking it from the past and placing it into my present. I learned my grandmother's handwriting. She used the same shaky cursive to caption her photographs as she did to write letters to friends, while titles were always written in block capitals. I scanned every photograph. I retyped every diary. Every word went from her fingertips to my own. I paid close attention to the names and places I found in the archive. These details were found on the backs of photographs, on official documents, within the pages of journals, and on stamped letters sent from one country to another. I listed the names chronologically and took note of how she had gotten from one place to another and which train station she had stopped at. When my grandmother started telling me her story, she said she had felt like she was going on a big adventure. That's what her archive felt like as well. I began buying books about World War II and the Holocaust. It is the most well-documented genocide from the side of the perpetrators and the victims. I learned the basic facts quickly. World War II began on September 1st, 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland from the west. A few weeks after that, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. The persecution of the Jews started far before that. I taught myself about the roots of anti-Semitism and the rise of the Nazis. It felt like a puzzle. The history books helped me understand my grandmother's story, and my grandmother's story helped me understand the history books. During these early years of obsession, I shared an apartment in Boston with two friends. I was stringing my rent together by working various jobs, primarily through photography, international travel programs, and teaching. My future felt like it was on the edge of exciting, but not yet burdened. My roommates and I hung white lights around the living room and lit candles while listening to Bob Marley, Kendrick Lamar, and Rudimental. We played games, made friends with each other's friends, and went to concerts. It was that time in life when we were all making bold decisions for ourselves, but not the kinds that have to do with kids and marriage. We were all just figuring it out. Barack Obama was president and change was happening. Life was moving and love was flowing. With each new photograph I scanned or diary entry I transcribed, I became more and more committed to my grandmother's story. It had been almost 4 years since Hannah had died, and I'd spent too many years buried in her story to not let it take me somewhere. So I decided I would literally follow in her footprints. I would live in every country she had lived in. I would travel the way she had. I would track down all the characters from her journals, all the names listed in her letters and documents, and most importantly, I would try to find the people who had saved her life. In her diary, my grandmother called the Holocaust an incomprehensible black page of history. I wanted to know what happens when you turn the page. When I think back upon my book and this question of what happens when you turn the page of genocide to the next generation, this has really been my motivating fascination. I moved to Europe about 5 years after my grandmother began telling me her story, as that passage tells you. I went to all the places she had lived, and I built relationships with strangers whose family history had intersected with my own. In some cases, I moved in with these people as well. In every case, these people became more than strangers, and they became even more than friends. Those whose histories intersected with mine became the individuals that I would experience life with throughout my 20s. They were the people I celebrated milestones with and were individuals with whom I grieved. I found my role as a grandchild change throughout this work as well. No longer was it my role or my reality that I could accept what came before as normal, but my role with inheriting this history was to feel responsible and to be responsible for the memory, to do something with it, to make the world better with it. So in 2015, when I was traveling around Europe studying my grandmother's war story, the refugee crisis came to a boiling point. And for the first time in history, the number of displaced persons in the world surpassed those numbers that were in the aftermath of World War II. And many political leaders in the Western world began to use language that was frighteningly similar to that which narrated my grandmother's young life. The way the world changed around me and continues to change around me, both politically and personally, has completely shaped the way I understand and also has shaped the way that I tell my grandmother's story of refuge. The second passage I'm going to read to you is from a scene of summer of 2016. The names that I'm going to mention are some of the people whose stories have blended with my own, particularly Rabbi Bent Melchior, the former chief rabbi of Denmark, who happened to be on the same refugee boat as my grandmother in 1943. And you'll also hear about the Persson family, a Swedish family who are responsible for saving my grandmother and Bent Melchior's life. I visited Bent Melchior again, the rabbi who had been on the same refugee boat as my grandmother. It had always felt comfortable with him, but now it felt natural. Time had turned him into the type of friend that I wouldn't dare not visit when in town. I was eager to hear his reflections on the refugee crisis. I wanted to know if current events were changing his memories the way that they were changing my grandmother's memories for me. I left Europe last year in June, I first reminded him, and within a couple of weeks of being back in the United States, all over the media were photographs, articles, and debatable opinions about the thousands and thousands of refugees arriving in Denmark and Sweden. They were talking about closing borders. And while the borders have remained open, there are now passport checks in places there weren't a year before. How does that make you feel? Bent sat back in his chair, pulling the wire of the small microphone I had clipped to his shirt. When the Second World War ended, we were extremely optimistic, he began to say.
That was still even before we heard terrible things that happened in the camps. But we thought that mankind had suffered so much that they would understand that war was not the answer. We had lived to see miracles happen on the sea. When I'm standing there at the beach, looking at that water, I see myself on the bottom of that sea. And I think of these thousands of people who try to come over the Mediterranean today and who are at the bottom of the sea. And it is a shame upon our time that we let this catastrophe happen. I don't know how that shall be forgiven.
I also went back to Sweden that summer to visit the Persson family, the descendants of the fishermen who rescued the refugee boat my grandmother and Bent were on in 1943. Annika, Per Arne's daughter, offered to let me stay with her family and photograph a bit of their life. It was a cool August evening when she took me back to her parents' house. A summer storm had subsided a few hours before we arrived. The light flowed into their home and softly highlighted the framed newspaper article on the wall that told of Per Arne's lifelong friendship with Bent. It looked different to me now that my relationship with each of them had grown. It was personal. We shared this story. Next to the article, to my surprise, hung 2 framed photographs of my grandmother, one of Hannah and me near the time of her death, and one of my grandmother as a teenager. I had given the pictures to Per Arne and Marianne during my last visit. There was also a picture of me standing on the shore propped up on a table. As it had been with Bent, we were more comfortable around each other now that we had a 1.5 years of friendship behind us. Marianne and I were even Facebook friends. The computer from where she followed my travels overlooked the seashore that had become so famous in my retelling of my grandmother's journey. Annika once again did her best to translate the conversation, simplifying her father's stories to match her English vocabulary and often choosing to omit his dirty jokes. I asked how they felt about the thousands of migrants coming into their country. They explained that much of the conversation happening in their country was a question of status. Was someone a refugee or a migrant? How could one tell? Who was in charge of deciding? And regardless, was there space for them to stay? Who should be granted asylum and who should be sent back home? That evening, at my request, Annika and her husband brought me back to the former bed and breakfast where my grandmother had stayed her first night as a refugee in Sweden. I wanted to take more photos, not satisfied with what I had collected the year before. The house was only a couple of minutes down the road. They opted to wait in the car as I went to explore. It looked vacant from the outside. The sign that faced the street and advertised guest rooms was crossed out with white paint. The grass was a healthy green, and the bushes were no longer skeletons of bare branches. Folding wooden chairs created a social space on a slice of the yard. I picked up my camera to snap a photograph as a teenage boy walked onto the wraparound balcony. No photos, I heard a woman say, urgently opening one of the ground floor doors. I pulled the camera away from my eye and walked toward her, introducing myself in one quick breath. Hi, my name's Rachel. I'm a journalist from Boston. My grandmother stayed here when she was a refugee in 1943 during the Holocaust. I'm here working on a documentary project, and I'm just wondering, why can't I take pictures? She told me I couldn't take pictures because there were refugees living here now. Oh, okay, that's really interesting since my grandmother was here as a refugee almost 75 years ago. Would it be okay if I came in and saw the place? Without hesitation, she welcomed me into the group home. The walls were bare and the hallway was dark, speckled with only a little natural light. A few soccer balls were scattered around the place, and the communal areas looked lived in. I was told that only boys lived here now. All were between the ages of 14 and 18. Most were from Afghanistan, Syria, and Somalia, and all had arrived without their parents. I was introduced to a few of them. Some were cooking in the kitchen, others watched TV. They were all pretty indifferent to my presence. Did most of these boys come by boat? I asked as we walked from room to room. The social worker logged the points of their journey for me. Yes, most at some point came across the Mediterranean, and then from there up to Germany. In Germany, they boarded another boat, but a legal one, to take them here to Sweden. And is it okay if I take pictures of the house if nobody's in the photograph? I asked, for the story about my grandmother. Yes, that's fine, but please be careful. There have been some instances where houses like this have been burned down by people who don't want the refugees here. The shores of Sweden never looked the same to me after meeting those boys. That night, while photographing the sunset, I watched the Swedish flag flap aggressively in the wind as I set my camera on a tripod and did a series of self-portraits. A lone bench was nearby from when Per Arne was still able to leave his house without assistance. The rain had stopped, but the moisture in the air remained, and the sunset now draped the coast with pinks and oranges and reds that faded into shades of light and dark blues with purple hues. The white caps of the sea created a stark contrast to the sky as nightfall came nearer. The reflection of war was back. Able-bodied youngsters, stripped of their homes, their families, and their childhoods, laid their heads to rest within the same walls as Hannah once did. They ran from their countries with similar uncertainties, but said their prayers in a different language. As we commemorate Yom HaShoah, we are collectively an example of what happens when you turn the page after a generation of genocide. We remember and we retell our family stories to not only say never again to what happened to European Jewry during the Holocaust, but to also acknowledge that identity-based killing, whether it happens during a genocide or walking down the streets of your neighborhood, still surrounds us. Persecution, discrimination, and racism are not only deeply embedded in our histories, but are part of our present. We retell the stories of our ancestors to remember history and also to inspire action. Thank you so much for having me on this commemoration day, and I hope it's a meaningful evening.
Well, I hope you were all inspired by Rachel's words. I know I was. And I think collectively, when she says that we all need to make this world a better place, I think that's what our next three speakers will be attempting to inspire us to do as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Renee Ledbetter, who is has worked with the Shannon program, which, as I mentioned before, is managed by the United Way of Greater New Bedford. She's been with them since 2015 and has served as the director of the New Bedford Shannon Initiative since 2019. In her position, she is responsible for managing all prevention and intervention initiatives for youth at risk of gang violence, whose history and demographics make them vulnerable for violent crime. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Renee. Thank you. If you can unmute yourself, Renee.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here tonight. So yes, I am the director of the New Bedford Shannon program, and the youth that we provide service to are ages 10 through 24. I just want to say that it's not just thinking about youth, it's any youth that's experienced violence in their life, whether it's domestic violence or just violence within themselves. A lot of the youth that we do service are traumatized and are dealing with trauma throughout, whether it's within their families or within the community. When George Floyd's murder occurred last year, I thought we were going to have more deaths than we did. I mean, we had enough, but it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. And I think the reason for that was, part of it was the youth that we do provide service to. We're learning about the history of racism, the systemic racism that has existed for hundreds of years. They were also learning that they can break the cycle. They are the generation that's here now that can break this cycle. During the year of George Floyd was also the year of COVID. That's when all youth or adults were struggling with their own mental health. And it was hard for them to process everything that was happening with George Floyd when they had to do it social distance, by socially distancing themselves from other people. So what I have to say about what's going on with racism right now, today, with our youth, a lot of them are not impacted necessarily by what happened in Minnesota, Kentucky, or any other place, Minneapolis. What they're affected by is what's happening right here in New Bedford. The way people look at them when they're in school, the way they're stereotyped based by the clothes they wear, based on where they live, how they live, who their parents are, who their siblings are. The systemic racism that happens right here in our own city is what's affecting them. The things that are happening to them in their own homes or with them in their own homes are a product of what's happening to their parents, or what has happened to their parents' generation, based off of systemic racism. So have we actually moved forward? Have we actually grown as a nation? I don't see it. I see that racism exists in many different forms, whether it's religious racism, whether it's color or gender, or even gender preference, sexual identity. There's so much that the kids are dealing with right now. They're trying to figure out who they are. And our job as the Shannon program is to help guide our kids in a direction where they will be able to pursue their dreams. And success looks different for all of us. So having a high school education is a big success for a lot of these kids. They can't even imagine going to college because right now, all they can think about is what's happening today. What we can do as a community in order to help our youth become productive citizens today is to accept them for who they are and try to meet them where they're at, help them grow into productive, positive citizens by stopping and saying hello instead of pointing your finger and accusing them of doing something they didn't do yet. So that's where the kids are. And I know, thank you, Masha, for inviting me, but I know you wanted me to talk about where the youth, what they're thinking in New Bedford, and that's what they're thinking in this community. They're thinking that people are judging them based off of the color of their skin or where they live or the clothes that they wear. How can we stop it? I don't know. I think we all have to work together. We all have to make sure that we are respecting each other's differences. And the only way that we're going to make any change in our community or any community is by working together. If we want our youth to become productive citizens, we have to start with the youth. So that means starting with our own families, our own kids, in our own families, and helping them understand that hate and racism is not welcome here. Whether it's because of religious preference or your religious background, or whether it's because of your racial background, it's not accepted here. And I don't think any one of us on this call needs to hear it, because we're here for a reason, because we've all had some sort of type of racism or discrimination in our background. But I think it's important for us to make sure that we share this and educate our community members and our children that racism and hatred is not accepted at any time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Now we're going to move on to David Gomes. He is at UMass Dartmouth. He's the Chief Diversity Officer. And 1 second, sorry. Not sure how I'm able to. 1 second, sorry. Sorry, he is the Chief Diversity Officer since 2020. Before his appointment at UMass Dartmouth, he served as the Director of the Diversity and Inclusion with the Office of Human Resources at UMass Dartmouth. He holds a law degree, and prior to working at UMass Dartmouth, he's had various positions in the field of equal opportunity and affirmative action throughout his career. So without further ado, I'm going to move on to Mr. David Gomes. If you can unmute yourself, please. Are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Gomes. The floor is yours.
All right. Thank you for that warm and gracious introduction. Again, my name is David Gomes. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. I am humbled and privileged to be here this evening. So I echo the sentiments of my colleague, Miss Renee Ledbetter. There's a well-known adage: those who do not learn history are doomed to repeat it. I'm sure all of us are familiar with that saying. So over the course of our country's history, we as a nation have made tremendous strides in the area of civil rights, human rights, and fair treatment of all, regardless of one's race, sex, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, political affiliation, socioeconomics, background. But unfortunately, and I'm speaking for myself, our nation has seen the pendulum swing backwards, particularly with the outgoing administration. We have witnessed unsavory and dangerous elements emerge from the shadows in the form of white supremacists, conspiracy theorists, anti-Semites, anti-LGBTQIA, anti-Muslim, anti-women, anti-immigrant, which has caused an erosion of the fabric of our democracy in direct contradiction to the message of hope, peace, tolerance, and equality that our country is supposed to stand for. As you have all witnessed, our nation has seen a rise in hate crimes and acts of violence perpetrated against individuals merely because of what they look like, where they worship, or who they choose to love. Most recently, we've seen a significant rise in attacks against our Asian American Pacific Islander brothers and sisters across the United States. So we need to be prepared to take these challenges head on, because our cities, our towns, our neighborhoods, and schools are under attack and are not immune to racism, sexism, homophobia, and xenophobia. So in my role as the Chief Diversity Officer at UMass Dartmouth, one of my primary responsibilities is to drive positive culture change on my campus in furtherance of our goal of creating a welcoming, socially just, and inclusive home for our students, faculty, and staff to live, learn, and thrive. You know, at my university, as a community of educators, the university has a platform and a moral obligation to do better. UMass Dartmouth has been in existence for 126 years. That's 126 years of oppression, and that oppression is not going to be solved overnight. So we have an interest in promoting a genuinely inclusive campus environment in our recruitment and our retention efforts, in our educational programming, in our curriculum, and using our platform to help dismantle systemic racism that plagues our community, both locally and nationally. My institution, UMass, we value an environment that fosters a respect for differences and encourages inquiry into these differences with the aim to understand and appreciate the diversity of cultures, perspectives, and experiences. Well, I'm going to tell you this much. This effort should not be confined to one person or to one department, but to the entire campus community from the top down, from the chancellor on down. So what are we doing as a university? Again, hey, we're not immune. UMass Dartmouth is not in a bubble. We're seeing exactly what everybody else is seeing across the country with the rise of systemic racism. This George Floyd trial has got me on pins and needles, because what happens if that verdict comes back and the officer is acquitted? I shudder to think that this nation is going to explode. And we just need to be prepared for that. So we know the university has a lot of work to do in this area, and we're committed to doing it. One of the things that UMass Dartmouth has done is create a diversity strategic plan. So that plan helps to serve as a guide to help UMass embrace diversity, equity, and inclusion while advancing social justice. So UMass Dartmouth's diversity goals require institutional collaboration with complete commitment from the entire UMass Dartmouth community. This plan is rooted in recommendations from the community, from our Diversity Council, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about the Diversity Council and what we're doing, principles of inclusive excellence, and best practices in diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice research and scholarship. So at this moment in history, the future of our country appears uncertain. Human rights, civil rights, which so many people have sacrificed dearly to achieve and protect, are being attacked and challenged. At times like these, the university returned to our core values and collective wisdom. Our core values include respecting the rights and dignity of each individual and group, and rejecting prejudice and intolerance, and working to understand those differences. So another thing that the university has done in furtherance of diversity and inclusion. So after a 2-year hiatus, the university actually reconstituted its Diversity Council. Diversity Council is comprised of 25 members of the faculty, staff, student, as well as the local community, who serve in an advisory capacity to our chancellor and to his cabinet on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, UMass Dartmouth, we're not immune to acts of systemic racism, sexism that go on. So we have a council, among other entities on our campus to help with that. One exciting thing that I'd like to announce to this group, and this is very cutting edge, the university actually competed for and won funding to launch a transformative justice certificate program. So UMass Dartmouth has actually worked in collaboration with UMass Law School, as well as Massasoit Community College, to build a foundation for, to build a certificate program for transformative justice. So a lot of people have worked with restorative justice or conflict resolution. They have certificate programs for these entities. Transformative justice is cutting edge. This is the new deal. UMass Dartmouth is actually leading the effort in this particular area. So we're extremely excited about that. And this could branch out to other universities across the nation. So the university, the police across the nation have been under scrutiny. The university has implemented a new police department oversight committee, which serves as an advisory group that will be, that's consisting of faculty, staff, and students. The committee will review campus police department training practices and policies, including policies governing the use of force, as well as general data and information about complaints. So the police have actually been under tremendous scrutiny. My family, I come from a family of law enforcement background, law enforcement officers, so I have a healthy respect for law enforcement professionals, but it's those few bad actors that give the profession a black eye, if you will. So other things that we're doing in order to further diversity and efforts on my campus, you know, as a chief diversity officer, I hold listening sessions with students just to get a pulse of what's going on with the campus, how they're feeling, what's going on. UMass Dartmouth is quickly becoming a minority majority university, meaning our student population is approximately 35 to 40% students of color. So we need to take care of that particular constituency. And one way is by holding listening sessions to actually hear from the students as to what's going on and to develop clear action items to be communicated to the campus community. We are enacting a campus climate survey. The last campus climate survey that we conducted was in 2013 as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion measures. We are long overdue for a new survey. So my office is leading that effort. The other thing is collaboration. We talked about collaboration. UMass Dartmouth is part of the UMass system. There are five sister campuses in total. So we're reaching out and collaborating with not only our sister campuses, but UMass is part of the Connect program. So we've built relationships not only with Bristol Community College, but Massasoit Community College, but it's a conglomeration of about 42 community colleges and universities. The other thing that we are resuming post-COVID is we take our students on what we call social justice trips. Social justice trips is actually, we actually pinpoint a site of cultural significance. For example, the last social justice trip that we took our students on was to Washington, D.C., to the African American Museum of History and Culture. It's not just a free trip for the students. They have to actually write a report and report back to the campus community about what they learned. So this is a tremendous experience. So one thing in terms of takeaways, what we tell our students is to remain vigilant in pushing forward an agenda of social justice and equality to combat the systemic racism that they encounter. Encourage them to join organizations like the NAACP, the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, National Women's Law Center, your local city council, school boards as a platform to effectuate change. The other thing is, as I said, UMass has been in existence for 126 years. Change does not occur overnight. We encourage our students to be patient but persistent. So knowing that, being persistent with these efforts could lead to positive culture change. With that being said, I can go on, but I wanted to end there and turn the program back over to my other panelists. So thank you for your time. I appreciate that.
Thank you for your words, Mr. Gomes. I'm going to turn over to Mr. Robert Delisle from BCC. He's the director of the Bristol Community Multicultural Center. He's extremely active on campus and in the community on diversity issues. He has also been spearheading through the center the sponsorship of regular programming related to diversity. So Mr. Delisle, if you can unmute yourself, please. And we give you the spotlight.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, fantastic. Wonderful.
And I apologize, it does say my internet is a little slow. So if it is, just please let me know if it is.
Okay.
Again, thank you for having me on this commemorative day. My name is Rob Delisle. I am the Director of Multicultural Affairs at Bristol, and I'm also serving right now as an interim Vice President for Student Affairs for the college up until July. When Dr. Ron Weisberger invited me to speak today, I just said, absolutely. Our collaboration with the Jewish community for my MLK programming through a Holocaust Center at Bristol, through the hard work of Dr. Ron Weisberger. It's just been phenomenal seeing our communities really coming together and working hand in hand. Mr. Weisberger has done many of my programs and have, collaborated in many of the things that we have done, and vice versa. And we have helped each other out. And that's pretty much why what I want to choose to speak about today is really this sense of community and belonging, which I think is really bridging this gap. A lot of times when we talk about diversity, if you Ms. Ledbetter and Mr. Gomes, they spoke eloquently about the issues that are at hand in America today, the things that we see on a daily basis through the media, through our stories, through our history. What has happened, centuries ago or also decades ago, and we just seem like history seems to repeat itself in many different ways. It evolves and it just comes at us a little differently. So one thing that, what we can do at our college campuses and within our communities is figure out ways that we can end this hate, this violence, the crimes that we are seeing against people who are innocent, who are just trying to live their lives and build futures. It's sad to see the things that have taken place. Last month, what happened in Atlanta, Georgia, to last year, what we saw happening to George Floyd, to attacks on many of our places of prayer and places of freedom. It has just really have made us live life on edge a little bit and uncomfortable. And it's unfortunate that this is the way our world is. Sometimes we walk in fear and it's done by design. However, as Ms. Ledbetter said, last summer, seeing everyone come together and walk the streets, our youth being together and showing unification, whether they're white, Black, Asian, Hispanic, old, young, just really walking the streets for justice and peace. It really showed an alliance that we have good out there and that we can defeat this hate. And it really spurred a lot of my work moving forward to say, our younger generations, they have an understanding, they're going through it, but now they're past it. They need us, who are the elders, the individuals who are in middle management, upper management, individuals that have, you know, a little bit more cliche or a little bit more cachet or a little bit more power to really step up and back up their work. So as they marched and I, you know, watched and saw, I decided to work with our school and our president and had a conversation about launching what's called social justice forums. These forums were put in play for us to say, you know, a lot of the people, I was talking to many of people in the community, and a lot of them says, they just don't know what to do. They feel small, they want to impact the world, but they just don't know how to. And it's an uneasy feeling when you want to do something and you just don't know how to do it. So after the George Floyd incident, we created what's called the Fast Action Forum, and the forum was put together within a couple of days for our whole community to come together, not just the college community, but our external community. So we had individuals from Bedford, Fall River, all of Bristol County, beyond Bristol County, come together into a forum. And it was around over 300 people in this place where we just talked about what's happening in the world. And it was an unbelievable experience where individuals from all races, all ages spoke. There's a lot of tears shed. There was a lot of stories that were spoken that really kind of brought us to say, what is our next step as a community to move together? And then that really sparked what is called our social justice forums. In those forums, we decided to talk about race and the intersection of race within many different variables, whether it be disability, whether it be religion, whether it be sexual orientation, whether it be educational inequities, whether it be immigration and immigration rights, whether it be mental health. We really started to come together and have these forums where we brought people in from the community as partners, and we also brought people within our college community and way beyond. We've had individuals from all around the country and even outside the country come in and have these conversations. And these conversations really brought us to a place where our college community and our local constituents really started saying, how can we partner to make this something that's sustainable, that can happen a long period of time, over a period of time, and we continue doing this. So we created a newsletter, and this particular newsletter is, right now we have about over 500 subscribers to this newsletter, which is excellent. And what this newsletter does, it kind of really organizes the how-tos. If you're unfamiliar with the Jewish community, or you're unfamiliar with the Black and African American community, if you're unfamiliar with the Asian community, or the Hispanic community, if you're unfamiliar with understanding gender and women's rights, unfamiliar with educational inequity or policing and police violence, we put together a newsletter that comes out periodically that continues to teach you, and it's ongoing and will continue to build. The goal and the vision is to really have individuals, no matter where you are, to be able to lead and help influence your circle. And wherever your circle may be, it's okay that some of us have a bigger platform to, I'm fortunate enough to have a whole entire college where I can put together a curriculum or put something together in order to influence a college campus. Some of us, it's okay that maybe our space is only our household, because that's how we begin to exponentially grow in understanding to chip away at barriers of hate and violence that we have seen. I do have, I will put it into the chat, are links to the actual newsletter where you can subscribe and you can get this information, and also be able to watch some of the videos, which are very, very educational. Our particular one that we're doing now, that we're doing at this moment, are called our Black Male Experience, where we are looking at the actual Black male individuals who are journeying through our local communities and our schools, and giving them an opportunity to individuals to learn a little bit more about that experience. In the future, we will also have these conversations about many different races and identities as we go through, because we want to really highlight all of our students and all of the people who live within our community. In doing this, we have partnered up with our MLK breakfast, which a lot of individuals on this call have been to. We appreciate Rabbi Cantor, who's helped and been part of that as well, along with Ron Weisberg and many of you that have been here. We've decided to turn that day into a day of service, not just a breakfast, where we're doing workshops and stuff for the community. And again, showing that we are one together and looking at healing and bridging these gaps that we that we need to continue to chip away at. I just, again, being part of this conversation and being here, and I know there's so many different programming and things that I can throw that we do throw in here that we do at our college, and I don't, it's overwhelming. So I'm going to share a couple of links and things that you can have to, if you would like to, study or take a look at it or get in touch with me, please do so. Over the last year, it's been a tough year for a lot of us. It's been a lot of hurt, a lot of things that we are just unfamiliar with. We just don't know what direction to go at times. But seeing events like today and seeing our young people go out there and stand against hate, and people saying, you know what, this is not going to happen on our watch, is exactly where we are, is exactly the love and where and how we change, and we can do it little by little. And I'm so proud of events like this and people that are doing this work on a daily basis to help us see better days for our youth and beyond. It's our world, and we're entitled to living in peace and harmony, and it's okay to stand up for what we believe is right. So again, I thank you. I'll leave it to the panelists. I'll put into the chat a couple of the links that you can register if you would like to receive the newsletter, or if you want to ever have a conversation with me, please feel free to do so. Thank you.
Thank you for those words, and thank you for the links as well. Definitely appreciate that. I'm going to open it up to our audience if you have any questions that you want to ask. Unfortunately, Mr. Gomes had to leave because he's teaching a class. So if anyone has any questions for Mr. DeLeo or for Renee Ledbetter, you can unmute yourselves and ask away.
Yeah, this is Amir. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Amir.
Okay, I'd like to ask both of them the same question. If they can, tell us from experience a real life story with perhaps an effect of how they've addressed a situation with a student or a group around or surrounding an event where racial injustice was visible or occurred, and how that was addressed utilizing the tools and the methods and the methodologies that they described when they spoke previously.
Do you mind if I go first, Rob? Or okay. So I could describe last year with the Black Lives Matter protest. They were walking around the city peacefully, going to different areas. At one particular point, they went into a hotspot area. And a hotspot area is an area where it's kind of known for its drug use or, violence, what the city considers a hotspot area. where there's a lot of the poverty. And the police called. It was getting ugly and violent. And some of the people that we deal with were getting riled up. So you have to understand the participants that we service are already on 150, right? Because of whatever trauma or whatever is happening in their life. So they're already like at a level where they're way up here. And then you add that to it. You add the protesters to it, and it creates a more volatile situation. So what happens when that explodes? Who's going to get arrested? Not the kids protesting, but the kids that are there, that live in that area, that are known either for selling drugs or violent acts or gang activity or whatever the situation is. So what happened was the police department called me and said, can you get your people, your Shannon outreach? She might have an outreach team of there's 14 altogether, 14 staff, and there's 10 outreach members, 10 members of our outreach team. So I called the ones that were on call and asked them if they could meet me down on Ruth Street. So they said, as soon as your guys get here, because it was starting to escalate, and they were, yelling at the police because they were angry. And a lot of our youth are filled with anger because of the way they're treated. So they said, once you get here, we'll leave. They just wanted them to leave. It was someone had OD'd a couple of days before, and they were having a vigil. And so it was a big mess. So as soon as two of my guys arrived on the scene, the police did leave. They left so we can kind of deal with that situation and talk to them. Because what we do is we don't just work with the youth individually, we also respond to critical incidents to try to keep the peace. So there was a fight that was brewing. We were able to keep the peace, and we were able to stop people from being arrested that night and try to talk to the young protesters and explain to them they were in a very dangerous situation, and in order for us to get any results, we have to do it by action and not with behavior. So I don't know if that's what you were looking for, Mayor, but that's one story that I can tell you.
Yeah, and looking at stories, I mean, and things that happen, I can't tell you, there's so many of them. And then, a lot of, there's some of the stories are, just because of my position, I cannot tell them, right, because of privacy. But there are things that we have seen that we had to react to pretty fast, whether that be destruction of space, inappropriate writing on walls, and symbols on walls and things. And when you're a public institution like Bristol, it's really tough because there are laws that are put that you are allowed free speech as long as it's not hate speech, and there are certain things that is actually it's actually legal. So it's really tough to balance between what can be said and done, and some of the students that are completely against what other students or other individuals around the community may do. But just this past year with the Asian hate, we end up with we had several incidents, not on campus, but around where the community, where some Asian community members were targeted. And so what we did is we brought together pretty fast, what's called a fast action forum, and had a forum where we brought people together to talk about what was happening in the community, to stop some of the, to make sure that we're unified, that our police are involved and having a good understanding of what's happening in the Fall River and New Bedford areas. And we brought that together. We have different professors and different people that came together immediately in order to kind of, let's see if we can ease the the anxiety of our student body as this is happening, because it's really unfair to particular students when things are like that are happening. A couple of years ago, another story would be there was destruction, and there was a lot of anti-Semitic things that were there, and there was some vandalism. And I remember Dr. Weisberger had to react and was immediately, and was also part of like ABC 6 News and all that, because we had to really come together immediately and do these things in a drop of a, you know, in 1 second you're doing one thing, and the next second you're moving really fast towards something else. So again, these type of stories and reactions happen pretty fast. They're unpredictable. We can kind of have the foreshadow to see what is happening. So if there is a protest, or if there is something that violent that we see on TV, or something that happens, we are prepared to have either forums or get people together or have conversation for our students so they feel safe. Because it's, you know, we understand that a lot of people will go through some trauma. I know that a lot of our students who are of color, who have witnessed police brutality, have trauma when they see things like that on television, because it is something that they may have dealt with. And so we kind of just, again, are just prepared whenever there is a situation to react and to do it in a timely manner where it's peace first, and really making our students feel comfortable. And so that's what we pretty much do a lot of the time.
Everybody should be able to unmute themselves now. I know there was a bit of a difficulty unmuting, but you should be able to do that now. So if anyone else has some questions they'd want to direct at our panel,
Renee,
you may do.
You had just mentioned how high school graduation is a big milestone of success for these kids. How hard is it going to be for them to readjust to the kids that you work with, that you know firsthand? How hard is it going to be for them to readjust to going back to school and socializing and hitting the books after COVID, and this big gap in their education and just being allowed to be kids?
Right. That's a good question, because before I got on the call, I was rushing back from meeting with some youth that just lost a family member that was their guardian. And one of them was saying that he'd rather just stay remote because he won't get into those situations where he gets in trouble, gets suspended. But it's been very difficult for our youth, and I think any youth. I think it's taken a toll on their mental health. It's taken a toll on their ability to focus when it comes to school. I know as they get older, I mean, I don't know about you know, the college students, but I could imagine it's just hard for them too. I know for me as an adult, being on Zoom meetings all day is draining and sucks the life out of you. So one of the
nice to see you, Renee. I haven't seen you in so long.
It's nice to see you too. But I think one of the main things that is really going to be a struggle for our kids is, like you said, Masha, is going back to that same old routine, that back to the routine that they were in before COVID. But I think it's also going to be a refreshing and a welcome change for them, because some of them are isolated. Right. And they need that socialization, right, in order for them to grow. And one of our motto with New Bedford Shannon is EDGE, and that is, we hope that they educate. We try to educate them on the challenges and choices that we make. We try to help them develop their mindset and develop personally. We guide them through whatever challenges that they may have, and we empower them to be able to advocate for themselves as well as make the right choices. So with school going back, I think with our population, it's a blessing and a curse at the same time, because a lot of our kids are already behind, because you can't expect them to do remote learning. They're not going to sit in the house especially if their parents are at work. So if they're home and they're 16 or 15 and they're unattended, a lot of them are out in the streets doing whatever and not really focusing, doing the remote. So what we're going to see and experience as a community is we're going to see a lot of kids being left behind. We're going to see a lot of the youth not graduating with their class. We're going to see, we already see a change because a lot of kids have either been dropped out involuntarily or have dropped out themselves as soon as they turn 16 about this year. So it's a challenge. It's been a challenge, and I think it's going to be a challenge going back as well.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments?
Manya, it's Amir again. Manya,
Okay,
it's
I'll let
Amir
you
again.
jump in.
I want to do a little bit of putting together. I don't want to call it a recap, but I want to bring us back to where this got started. Today is Yom HaShoah, and today we commemorate the most atrocious and heinous part in the history of mankind. In that chapter, as Jews, we were targeted more than most, perhaps more than any. And that is why we stop and remember this day. When Mayor Mitchell spoke at the beginning of this evening, he was paraphrasing a little bit on the words of Dr. King when he said that when we allow racism, we create a foundation for genocide. I may have paraphrased even more, but the idea is the one that is important. The reason why today we attempted to connect the story and the commemoration of the Holocaust with some of the modern challenges of social injustice is perhaps more than anything to highlight how all of these things stay connected. I would like to hope that despite the less than perfect platforms of Zoom and the fact that we were at the monument in a very small forum, did not distract us too much from that message. I'd like to think that most, if not all of us, are walking away from this Zoom version of our commemoration with the right memories and the right lessons. For those who don't remember, the Holocaust service last year was the first major program that our federation conducted over Zoom. We are a year ahead, and all of a sudden, it seems almost the most normal thing to do to conduct these kind of programs over Zoom. I hope that the fact that we've become more proficient, I dare say even pretty good at this, make this program more effective and more efficient. I invite as many of you and all of you to communicate, write about it, and want to remind everyone that today's program is being recorded and should be available for all of you to reach online when you choose to do so. I say this because there are several educators around the table, and your ability to link to this story is going to be there for a long period of time. And I think that there were enough important words said today to make this worthwhile. So I thought it was important for me to wrap up or package how I personally viewed the totality and the togetherness of this, and hope that by doing so, it might have helped others underline or put together maybe a finishing touch on what we just did. And if not, that's my version. And I hope it works for you too.
Okay, I'm going to add a
Thank you for that. And I'm going to go back and mute.
Okay, I'm going to add a few words myself, actually. If you do get a chance to listen to Rachel Serrati's podcast, We Share the Same Sky, it's very interesting on so many levels. But she does mention it at one point in one of the episodes, I think there's 7 episodes in total. She draws the line and says, you know, it was the Danish people then the Danish neighbors, when her grandmother was in Denmark, that took her in, gave her shelter, and showed her love without prejudice. Whereas it was her grandmother's parents' town in Czechoslovakia that didn't do that, that turned their backs on their Jewish neighbors. And she made the distinction between the neighbors that opened their arms and the neighbors that turned their backs. And I think, Mr. Daly, you referred we're referencing it a couple of years ago when the Jewish cemetery was vandalized in Fall River. And for me, that was a moment of fear. And at the same time, it was also a moment of hope, because actually it was the Muslim community that reached out a hand and showed that they were our brothers and our sisters against hate. And that's one of the most profound lessons that we all at this table should learn, that it's when everybody sees you as a brother and a sister, that you have the support of everybody, that what might seem frightful and almost insurmountable actually becomes something that you no longer fear. And I think as communities, this is what this program is about. It's basically to tell you these horrible things can happen. However, if we all act as brothers and sisters, as neighbors that refuse to turn their backs on each other, but instead embrace each other, then we can make this world a better place. So,
all right.
I will end the program now, and I want to thank all of our speakers from the bottom of my heart. Thank you so very much for being part of this. And I think this is the beginning of a relationship between our communities that we can do but build on.
Yes.
So thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.